and how we can resist the erosion of civil, political, and human rights threatened by these developments. I'd now like to recognize Congressman Smith for his opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for convening this very important hearing. Mr. Chairman, as we all know, the motto of the 2022 Beijing Olympic Games is, quote, "Together for a shared future," ostensibly expressing an ideal of global solidarity and goodwill that is cherished globally. No one betrays this model more flagrantly and violently than the Chinese Communist Party. With its increased global stature and power, the People's Republic of China has been given an opportunity to become a responsible member of the global community. Although my reservations have never abated. 41 years in Congress, I have had deep concerns about the Chinese Communist Party, and indeed, I chaired 4 congressional hearings for the first 22 years ago on December 8th, 1999, on why China should not be accepted into the WTO until systematic human rights violations that are pervasive were stopped. Yet the global community, from businesses to governments to the International Olympic Committee, continues to welcome China with open arms. Unfortunately, the PRC has used its power and stature to coerce as a means to achieve their ends. What the CCP deems as fitting Chinese national interests at the expense of fair and transparent international relations, giving lie to the saccharine sweet shared future Olympic Games rhetoric. We used to worry about the PRC cultivating soft power and persuasive policy tools, and that is a concern. But that worry was misplaced. There is nothing soft about the CCP's increasingly naked tactics of economic coercion. As our expert witnesses will likely tell us today, the PRC's first notable act of economic retaliation occurred in 2010, as China blocked salmon imports from Norway after the Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to Chinese human rights activist Liu Xiaobo. For the Philippines, the fangs were bared after the country confronted China in 2012 at Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. The Philippines discovered that its tropical fruit exports to China were quarantined due to alleged infestation. Mongolia was targeted after hosting the Dalai Lama. For South Korea, the economic retaliation came after deploying the U.S. missile system defense system. For the UK, it was for supporting pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, while China retaliated against the Czech city of Prague for signing a sister city deal with Taipei. Hardly a week goes by without some reporting of Chinese economic coercion. The most recent target seems to be Australia and Lithuania, and on multiple fronts. And some, the list just keeps growing, and it's not just restricted to any certain industry or region. Indeed, perhaps countries could take heart by Lithuania's brave resistance to the PRC, a country that suffered firsthand from the derogations of communism. Because of the openness to closer ties with Taiwan and its withdrawal from the Beijing-led 17+1 group of mostly Central and Eastern European countries, the PRC has stopped clearing exported goods from Lithuania through customs and has interfered with the workings of the Lithuanian embassy, in Beijing, in violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Rather than buckling under, Lithuania announced that its officials would not be attending the genocide Olympic Games in Beijing. Indeed, perhaps Lithuania would have gone even further had the U.S. led by example and fully boycotted the genocide Olympics, unless the venue were removed or moved from the PRC to another country. If the Chinese Communist Party truly desired to lead globally, it would cultivate trust and friendship. Yet even this short-term reliance on bullying seems to be backfiring. The adverse effect on China's counterproductive tactic of economic coercion truly is now seeing some consequences. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, in April 2020, an internal report was circulated by the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, a government-affiliated think tank associated with the PRC's top intelligence agency. This report concluded that, quote, global anti-China sentiment is at its highest since the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. Even in Asia, where strong economic ties with China are construed to be critical to development, anti-Chinese sentiment is indeed growing. Last year, Vietnam issued its first defense white paper in 10 years, in which it rejected Beijing's claims and criticized China's maritime tactics, citing, quote, unilateral actions, power-based coercion, violation of international law, militarization, change in the status quo, and infringement upon Vietnam's sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction as provided in international law, close quote. Malaysia and the Philippines are building up their militaries and strengthening outposts that would help push back against Chinese expansionism. The New York Times recently reported that anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea has also grown so much this year that China has replaced Japan, the former colonial ruler, as the country regarded most unfavorably in South Korea. China is reportedly also approaching challenges from within, tottering along a demographic precipice. From 2020 to 2050, it will lose 200 million working age adults and gain 200 million senior citizens, all of which will impose monumental social and economic costs, severely testing China's leadership. And all of that is attributable, of course, to child limitation policies, including the almost 40-year one child per couple policy. Moreover, China is running out of resources too. Water has become scarce, and the country is importing more energy and food than any other nation. It is evident that where its leadership rational, the PRC would change its behavior to obtain global support and cooperation. Yet under Xi Jinping, the genocide dictator, it does not do so. Today's hearing is yet more evidence that the PRC's economic coercion and its attempt to silence critics have not gone unnoticed. And again, I thank you for putting this together, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Swazi, do you have opening remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for yet another hearing where we are trying to call to people's attention of what the Chinese Communist Party is up to and what they are trying to do to impose their will throughout the world. I sound like a broken record, but I've said this before that, ever since the 1970s, when Nixon went to China, we thought that the more that China was exposed to the United States and to the West generally, the more they would become like us, the more they would look at the ideas of democracy and of human rights and of capitalism. And that just has not happened. They do not share our values in any way whatsoever. And in the 1980s, we were worried about the car companies from Japan and Germany taking over our manufacturing base, and they did a pretty good job of it. But we changed the way we did business, and we really moved aggressively with technology and globalization, looking for the best prices wherever we could throughout the world. And China was a great opportunity for us to reduce the cost of consumer goods here in the United States of America. But now we are paying the price. China has become one of the world's dominating forces, and they are breaking the rules on a regular basis. And that's why this hearing is so important to talk about how they're using their power. We talk about in America all the time the whole of government. Well, the Chinese Communist Party is certainly using the whole of government to advance their ideas and to try and hide from the world how they even treat their own people, whether it's the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region or the students in Hong Kong or the Buddhists in Tibet. They just subjugate people and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, because they want to have uniformity in their country. But they're using every single possible tool at their disposal, whether it's intellectual property theft, whether it's forced technology transfer, state intervention in markets, and certainly the Belt and Road Initiative. And now we see that whenever anybody dares to speak out about their treatment of the Uyghurs, or to speak out about their treatment of the press or the students in Hong Kong, or their treatment of the Buddhists, they will do everything they can using the whole of government to try and hurt them economically, whether it's the NBA or basketball teams or celebrities or major corporations of the United States of America or manufacturers or hotel chains. They will do whatever they can to withhold economic benefit, to sanction, to hold American and international companies accountable for saying something that they disagree with. And we need to continue to wake up the people of the United States of America and the world community as to the abuses by the Chinese Communist Party. And we need to recognize that they're pretty effective. They have managed to use the whole of government and use every tool in their toolbox to suppress a discussion about their human rights violations, about their unfair trade practices, and about their attempts to try and become the global power economically, militarily, technologically. We have such an important role. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to call everyone's attention to what the Chinese Communist Party is up to and the power and effectiveness they are using to do that. Tom Lantos, a Holocaust survivor and former member of Congress, and certainly one of our great advocates for human rights, said the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians and we can never rest. And that's why this hearing and the other hearings you've held, Mr. Chairman, are so important. And we thank you for doing it. And we appreciate the witnesses for being here today to share their thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd now like to introduce our panel. Bonnie Glaser is the Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She was previously a Senior Advisor for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Glaser is a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, and a Senior Associate with the Pacific Forum. Zach Cooper is a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Co-Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He also teaches at Princeton University, is a partner at Armitage International, and co-hosts a net assessment podcast for War on the Rocks. He previously served on staff at the Pentagon and White House and has conducted research at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Jenny Wong is a Senior Strategy and Research Associate at the Human Rights Foundation, where she works on Asia-related research, projects, and campaigns, and spearheads the organization Oslo Freedom Forum in Taiwan. She is co-author of the Human Rights Foundation's report, Corporate Intimidation and Censorship in China, Recommendations for Foreign Companies. Ho Fong Hung is Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Weisenfeld Professor in Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. He is the author of City on the Edge, Hong Kong Under Chinese Rule, Clash of Empires, From Chimerica to the New Cold War, and China Boom, Why China Will Not Rule the World, and Protest with Chinese Characteristics. Our witnesses will now proceed in that order. Ms. Glaser, you are first.
Chairman Merkley and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for holding this important hearing and inviting me to participate. As the world's top trading nation, the second largest market, and one of the largest providers of development finance, the PRC has the potential to wield significant influence by using both economic sticks and carrots. In the past decade, there have been dozens of instances of PRC economic coercion, which include threats and the imposition of economic costs by a state on a target with the objective of extracting a policy concession. China's employment of economic coercion and positive economic inducements have had only limited success in compelling targets to change their behaviors. But Beijing has successfully deterred countries and companies from undertaking actions harmful to Chinese interests, including refraining from criticizing PRC policies. There are known instances where Chinese officials have threatened economic consequences against countries that refuse to side with China in votes at the UN Human Rights Council. Since 2010, the PRC has used economic coercion more and more frequently. And in virtually every case, the targets have been companies and industries in democratic states, based on an apparent calculation that pressuring influential business constituencies in democracies will mobilize them to lobby their governments to change policies detrimental to China. Unlike traditional economic sanctions, Beijing's economic coercion usually relies on informal measures that provide plausible deniability and enable China to ratchet pressure up or down as needed. Chinese economic coercion tactics include import and export trade restrictions, tourism curbs, popular boycotts, and other measures. Over the years, Beijing has become increasingly bold in the use of such tactics. In two recent cases, the PRC has banned the import of almost a dozen products from Australia and blocked all imports from Lithuania in violation of WTO rules. Despite limited success and occasional blowbacks, Beijing continues to view economic coercion as a valuable tool in its economic statecraft toolkit. This is likely because it judges that the cost to China is negligible. Recent developments, such as the AUKUS deal and the pending EU anti-economic coercion tool, suggest that countries are willing to band together to impose greater economic costs on China. The United States should undertake unilateral steps, as well as with like-minded partners, to counter and deter potential Chinese economic coercion, as well as prepare measures to limit potential damage to companies and industries. First, the most effective defense against trade coercion is to diversify trade relationships. The U.S. should identify sectors which are overly dependent on Chinese markets on both the export and import sides, and therefore vulnerable to coercive trade practices. National and local governments should actively promote trade diversification. Second, the United States should help potential targets of economic coercion to develop tools to identify cases of trade coercion and respond quickly. Trade associations and other stakeholders should be encouraged to work closely with U.S. government agencies. Mechanisms should be created for sharing information and best practices. Third, American companies should have plans in place to respond to potential Chinese coercion. They should be encouraged to report all instances of coercion to appropriate U.S. government entities. Congress should explore how to appropriate funds for a vehicle to compensate companies affected by such coercion. Fourth, Congress should examine whether companies should be required to report or disclose when they are subject to pressure or benefits from Chinese measures, including subsidies. Also worth considering is requiring disclosure of significant import or export dependence on China in sectors closely linked to national security. Fifth, encourage private sector trade associations to develop a voluntary code of conduct regarding China. Such a code would include commitments by American companies to refrain from self-censorship and other activities that are contrary to U.S. values and interests. The U.S. should consider developing incentives that could be provided to companies that sign on to the code of conduct. Sixth, and finally, create a voluntary counter-coercion coalition of like-minded countries willing to push back against economic coercion. Collective steps could include encouraging targeted countries to pursue WTO dispute settlement cases against instances of economic coercion where WTO remedies are possible, taking retaliatory trade, investment, or other policy measures against China, and creating a counter-coercion reserve fund to compensate companies for economic losses. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today and for holding this very important hearing, Senator.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cooper.
Chairman Merkley and other distinguished commission members, thank you for the invitation to testify before you today. The topic of this hearing could not be more timely. Over the last few weeks, the world has watched as Beijing has attempted to silence one of China's brightest stars. Peng Shui's courage in speaking out stands in stark contrast to the Beijing government's efforts to censor her. This case highlights the lengths that Beijing will go to silence criticism both at home and abroad. Economic coercion is a particularly difficult challenge in this regard. In my written remarks, I argue that China's economic coercion against Norway, Mongolia, Australia, and the European Union and United States highlights three concerning trends. Specifically, China's economic coercion has become more frequent, more targeted, and more explicit. In terms of frequency, Beijing is growing more willing to use economic tools for foreign policy ends. Whereas there were only a handful of cases of clear economic coercion by China in the early 2010s, experts have identified dozens of incidents over the last few years. The Alliance for Securing Democracy, which I co-direct, collects data on this through our authoritarian interference tracker. We list, at the moment, 67 cases of economic coercion by China against companies and individuals and countries in the last decade, most in the last few years. And at the moment, our database only tracks transatlantic targets, so it doesn't deal with any of the Asian or other targets that are well known. These cases include not only threats, but also problematic positive inducements, which Audrey Wong has labeled subversive carrots. The evidence suggests that China's leaders are turning increasingly to economic tools, despite the fact that many of these actions have negative effects on China's standing abroad. At the same time, China's leaders have become more targeted in their use of economic measures. China's earlier pressure on Norway and Mongolia broadly impacted key economic sectors in each country, but more recent measures have been designed to isolate specific companies and individuals. Human rights activists, political leaders, and businesses have all come under pressure for actions that the Communist Party opposes. Even adhering to foreign laws can now put companies at risk under China's new anti-sanctions law. Finally, China's economic statecraft is far more explicit today than it was a decade ago. Beijing used to disguise most of its economic pressure, attempting to use ambiguity to make it more difficult to call them out as World Trade Organization violations. Today, however, China's leaders are more willing to be explicit when they use economic tools for coercive purposes. For example, Beijing has threatened to blacklist companies by putting them on an unreliable entity list. And amidst political disputes with Australia and Lithuania, China has explicitly applied economic tools for coercive purposes. In short, China's economic coercion is becoming more frequent, more targeted, and more explicit. This will require renewed efforts to protect our societies, deter future bullying, and punish Beijing when it acts coercively. I go into more detail on each of these in my written remarks, so let me summarize the main points here. As a starting point, we should aim to better protect ourselves through diversification. Dependence on China allows Beijing to accumulate influence over time and then to deploy that leverage coercively. There is no way to avoid these pressures entirely, but countries and companies can manage these risks through prudent diversification. At the same time, since our economies will no doubt remain interdependent, at least to some degree, we should seek to leverage our own economic power in certain strategic areas. Selective decoupling will no doubt continue, but it is also in our interest that China remain dependent on the United States and our allies and partners in certain areas. This should be seen as a counterpart to selective decoupling and should be implemented strategically in concert with key allies. Ultimately, the United States will have to work with like-minded countries to penalize China when it engages in economic coercion. The European Union's anti-coercion instrument should be a starting point for these discussions. In fact, China's coercion against Lithuania may provide an early test of this approach. Collective action will be critical since Beijing is hoping that it can use its economic heft to coerce smaller players. Thank you once again for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to joining the other panelists and addressing your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. And now we'll turn to Ms. Wong.
Chairman Merkley and members of the Commission, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I will be speaking about the authoritarian Chinese government, but more specifically, the stunning costs that multinational companies pay in order to appease the Chinese government and secure access to the Chinese market. On the face of it, this topic may seem like an economic issue, but it is a human rights and moral issue as well. Companies wishing to profit in China must be willing to comply with draconian Chinese national laws or face expulsion from the market. When companies deliberately choose to censor or apologize to appease the Chinese government, they are offering legitimacy to the authoritarian regime and signaling their willingness to disregard not only the human rights of others, but of their own too, as the cost of doing business in China. In March 2021, Swedish apparel brand H&M faced a boycott in China for simply releasing a statement of concern about Uyghur forced labor. The company lost approximately $74 million in sales for the quarter ending May 31st this year. With the 2022 Beijing Olympics just weeks away, it is expected that the Chinese government will continue its fierce campaign of economic coercion as a strategic tool to intimidate firms to remain silent about its human rights record. Based on my observations, as described in my written testimony, companies are now choosing from 3 methods to approach China's economic coercion. 1, they embrace it. 2, they capitulate to it. Or 3, they condemn it. We must be demanding better of these businesses that employ, supply, entertain, and house our people. When companies are not held accountable for embracing or capitulating to China's economic coercion, they will not fully recognize the severity of their actions. In order to approach China's economic coercion with human rights central to the discussion, immediate next steps should be to raise awareness about such coercion and to increase accountability. To raise public awareness and visibility, my recommendations are to approve legislation to establish the China Censorship Monitor and Action Group. The establishment of this group would be a critical first step towards raising awareness about how the Chinese government impacts the freedoms of multinationals, specifically those founded on liberal values in democratic countries. Additionally, Congress should mandate greater transparency among American companies by introducing legislation that would require them to publicly report their respective exposures to China. To increase accountability, my recommendations are to sign H.R. 1187 into law, which would mandate the Securities and Exchange Commission to define environmental, social, and governance ESG practices. Recently, there has been more awareness about climate change and environmental issues. It is imperative for corporations to remember ESGs also include human rights and ethical considerations. Furthermore, especially in light of the US's diplomatic boycott, we should request a follow-up with the witnesses of the sponsorship of the 2022 Beijing Olympics hearing to discern whether they have taken any concrete actions to address what was discussed. Businesses with global operations have great influence, both positive and negative. It is up to Congress to help influence, inform, and prompt them to uphold our values, to avoid complicity, and to stand firmly with human rights in response to China's economic coercion. I look forward to discussing this in more detail and answering your questions. Thank you for the humbling opportunity to testify before the Commission today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wong. And now we turn to Dr. Hung.
Chairman Merkley and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you very much for holding this very important hearing today, and it is my honor to have this opportunity to testify here today. My testimony will focus on the political and economic risk that U.S. corporations and investors face under the new political environment in Hong Kong after the implementation of the national security law. Hong Kong has always been an indispensable and unique offshore financial center of China. It is a doorway through which most money goes in and out of China. Hong Kong global financial center status hinges on its rule of law, freedom of the press, and the transparency of corporate governance. These foundations have been thorns on the back of the CCP leaders, whose secret wealth kept in Hong Kong were often exposed by journalists. Hong Kong-based Chinese front companies that helped Iran, North Korea, and other unruly regimes to evade international sanctions are often exposed by journalists working in Hong Kong. Under the new political environment, the Hong Kong and Beijing governments have been passing new laws besides the national security law that enhance political control and jeopardize these foundations. This summer, the Chinese government was ready to apply the anti-foreign sanctions law to Hong Kong. This law will force foreign corporations in Hong Kong to choose between violating international sanctions, US sanctions, or violating Chinese law. Such impossible choice will force many foreign corporations to leave Hong Kong. And in this context, the Biden administration issued a business warning to the American corporations in Hong Kong on July 16 this year. And in August, the National People Congress Standing Committee surprisingly announced it would delay the application of the law to Hong Kong. Beijing appeared to be hesitant about destroying Hong Kong's financial centrality too hastily, though it is expected the law's application to Hong Kong will come back sooner or later. For another example, the Hong Kong government has started restricting public access to information of directors and executives of registered companies. If such a restriction had been in place earlier, journalists and the US government would have never discovered that Huawei has been using a Hong Kong registered fund company to violate international sanctions on Iran and trick a foreign bank to become inadvertent accomplice in the scheme. Another troubling development is the passing of the anti-doxing law amendment in September this year. The amended law criminalized unconsented disclosure of private information, vaguely defined, without the need for proof of the harm done. It hands the government vast legal authority to prosecute dissidents and journalists who disseminate information about powerful elite. It expands the authorities' power to request internet platforms to remove contents. It also gives authorities the power to access electronic devices and search premises without a warrant. This law will force social media companies to comply with the Hong Kong authorities to delete posts or surrender users' information. Independence and integrity of financial regulator in Hong Kong financial market have also been under threat. Even before the implementation of the national security law in 2014, Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission fined and banned an American short seller for publishing a negative research report about Evergrande, the now troubled private property developer in China. It also fined and reprimanded Moody's, the credit rating agency, for a report that warned about corporate governance irregularities of 49 mainland Chinese companies listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Hong Kong government's denial of visas to foreign journalists covering financial news is equally troubling. As independent and critical research of Chinese business and government in Hong Kong became ever more difficult and corporate governance becomes murky, investment into the financial products issued by the Chinese governments and Chinese companies will become increasingly risky. US investors' involvement in these financial products also tie their financial fortunes to Chinese companies and Chinese government action that violate international sanctions and human rights. In light of the above, there are several things that the US government could do to protect the interests and integrity of US corporations and investors in Hong Kong. First, the US government could regulate tech companies and ensure that they will not become the accomplices of the crackdown on Hong Kong. Second, the US government could devote resources to develop technology and tools that residents in Hong Kong and elsewhere in China could use to bypass internet censorship and suppression. The relevant Hong Kong sections in the US Innovation and Competition Act of 2021 is a laudable first step, and it needs to become law soon. Third, US government could issue warnings or restrictions on investment in risky financial products issued by dubious Chinese entities and sold in the Hong Kong market. The Treasury sanctions restricting investment in Russian sovereign bonds earlier this year is a precedent. Fourth and last, foreign journalists in Hong Kong is the last line of defense for fair, clean, and level playing field for foreign companies in Hong Kong. The US government needs to use whatever diplomatic tool available to ensure the free operation of foreign journalists in Hong Kong. Again, I have to thank the chairman and the commission member for holding this hearing, and I look forward to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to proceed to 7-minute periods for questions. I encourage our witnesses to keep your remarks pointed and tight so we can get to as much information as possible. And Ms. Glazer, I wanted to start with you. You're arguing for collective strategies. The United States just announced a diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games to draw attention to both the stripping of political rights in Hong Kong, but very much also the genocide against very ethnic minorities, including the Uyghurs. And that's a determination, a genocide determination that has come from both Democratic and Republican administrations. We haven't heard Europe or other nations announce that they're going to join us in this diplomatic boycott to highlight. Do you see highlight what China has been doing and to prevent the Olympics from being used as a propaganda facade for China? do you anticipate other countries are going to join us, or how should the U.S. go about expanding its partnership in this?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Over the last 24 hours, I have also paid close attention, waiting for some of our allies and partners to similarly announce that they too will not have their officials attend the Olympics. I know that members of the Biden administration have been consulting very closely for months with our allies and partners on the issue of how we would respond to the Olympics. I personally think that it would have been ideal if the Olympics could have been moved out of Beijing. That way, athletes would be able to participate, but the spotlight would not be on Beijing. They would not be able to benefit from being host. Unfortunately, that path was not taken, and so now I think the only option really that is available to us is to try to get as many countries as we can to stand with us in this coalition. I hope that we will see in the coming days countries state that they too will not be sending their diplomats to the Olympics. And I am sure that, as I said, the Biden administration is continuing to have discussions with them. But I'm personally disappointed that we did not announce simultaneously with our allies and partners. And if they shy away from doing so and send their officials, then I think that undermines our ability to signal China that their practices in Xinjiang and the other human rights violations that they are pursuing are unacceptable.
You know, I was thinking about how China internally has such effective censorship to prevent Chinese citizens from knowing what is going on in the world in terms of reaction to China's policies. And pondering whether if there is enough publicity around these strategies of economic coercion, that the damage to China's reputation around the world might, in their eyes, start to exceed the value of trying to discourage criticism. Do you think that vocal, extended, multilateral commentary on China's human rights record and publicity about their economic coercion strategy might lead China to find in time that this is a strategy they should abandon?
Well, Senator, I agree with you that this is a message we should be sending around the world, though I personally think we will have more impact on other countries who are being affected. We should encourage them to speak out. Even in the case of Muslim-majority countries that are often standing behind China in supporting their activities in Xinjiang, we should be communicating with their peoples to encourage them to put pressure on their governments to speak out. But in terms of resonating with this message inside China, I'm personally less optimistic. And I think we need to impose costs, not just try to impose reputational costs, but real economic costs.
Thank you. Dr. Cooper, you have noted that selective decoupling could be an effective strategy, but you've also said that it's in our interest for China to remain dependent on the U.S. in some sectors. These two thoughts seem in tension with each other. How do you draw the line between them?
I think what's so important here, Senator, is that we can't cut all the links between the United States and China. And if we look first for the links that China is most dependent on, those are actually the links that give us the most leverage. And so it is very tempting to go after the economic sectors and the specific products that we know Beijing needs the most. But in doing so, we actually decrease our leverage over the long term. And so what I think we need is to work with allies and partners on a very specific plan to look at the areas that China is most vulnerable to and where it's most dependent on the United States and our allies and partners, and then to work with them, our allies, to figure out how to actually perhaps even increase China's dependence on some of those areas. So strategic decoupling in some areas at the same time as we strategically recouple in others.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Wong, when we see a situation how China treats Australia in blocking a dozen plus products, or we see how Lithuania is being treated with particular kind of complete exclusion of their products, how should kind of the free world respond to back up those countries and alleviate the economic costs and therefore undermine the effectiveness of China's strategies?
Thank you, Senator, for this question. How should the free world respond to how the Chinese government treats Australia and Lithuania? First, I think it is important for us to work closely with our allies and to work closely with our partners, but we should also be looking internally, domestically here as well. We need to also be pushing our companies domestically to be accountable and to learn more about the nature and the scope of China's economic coercion. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much. And with that, my time's expired. We're going to turn to Senator Rubio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming in and doing this. It couldn't be more timely, although this is a major issue all across the board. My questions are largely geared on something you've all talked about and what the purpose of this hearing is, and that is the ability to leverage economic power, whether that is direct spending and investments that they make, that China's Communist Party makes abroad, or access to their marketplace to get all kinds of actors to bend to their will, international organizations, countries and governments, and corporations. It is my belief, and I think well-founded, that there are major American corporations who are either witting or unwittingly lobbyists on behalf of the official narratives and policy preferences of the Communist Party of China. And the reason is pretty simple, and that is they go to them and say, if you want to continue to have access to our, whether they say it or they imply it, if you want to continue to have access to our marketplace, if you want to continue to be able to sell things here, which represents X amount of your annual revenue, then we expect you to go talk to your quote-unquote friends in America and get them to back off. And I think that perhaps the most stunning example of it has been the cowardly but real effort behind the scenes by several corporations who benefit from slave labor to impede the passage of the Uyghur forced labor bill that the chairman and I and so many others, including in the House, have been working on. So with that reality in place, we've got some things that we need to tackle. First, Ms. Glazer, I think in your testimony you recommended developing of a voluntary code of conduct for businesses regarding China, I think including a commitment to refrain from self-censorship. That's another pretty amazing thing, and that is how much of the information and news we today consume is self-censored because they don't want to not be able to distribute that program, that movie, whatever it might be, in a pretty large market. But how would we hold these companies accountable if they in fact signed this code of conduct? Obviously, this can't be a sort of a legal prescription. It sounds almost like a shaming and naming effort, but how would we first, get companies to sign on, but more importantly, how would they be held? Who would hold them accountable to violations of it, and how would we hold them accountable if we had such a code?
Well, thank you, Senator Rubio. It's very difficult, I think, to influence companies' choices as well as to hold them accountable. If companies don't sign up to a code of conduct, yes, we can name and shame and say they are not interested in adhering to our values and joining with other companies around the United States and the world to defend those democratic values. So yes, it is a mechanism essentially to name and shame and try to provide incentives for companies to get on board. In the case of something like slave labor, then I think you have more options. Because if you do good research and you identify that companies are using slave labor, you make that data public, then that company is going to be spotlighted in a way that it doesn't want to be. And perhaps people will buy fewer of their goods. People will write articles about them. This is going to be very negative in terms of, I think, their bottom line as well as their reputation. in terms of things like movies, obviously far more difficult because the Chinese have accumulated a great deal of influence because there's a lot of people who go watch movies in China. So I think that in that regard, you have to start with naming and shaming, and I think making something like this voluntary, you're more likely to get companies to join on board. At least it's a beginning step. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Wang, you talked about passage of Senate Bill 413 that establishes the China Censorship Monitor and Action Group, and I'm proud to be the lead Republican co-sponsor on this bill. I hope we can pass it swiftly. You recommend increasing transparency among American companies that are significantly exposed to China. Do you think it'd be a good idea to require U.S.-listed companies to disclose the existence of Chinese Communist Party committees and the role they play in the company's corporate governance in their annual reports to the SEC?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I do believe that American businesses should be disclosing these. I was reading a bit more about Hollywood, actually. I read a recent report by PEN America, and it stated that a lot of the filmmakers have private meetings with decision makers. So I think when we ask for transparency, we can ask about their market shares, their closed-door meetings, and who are they talking with? How can we better understand the situation when we don't have this data and we don't have this information? So yes, I do believe that we should be...
Just to be clear, when you talk about these private meetings, what you're basically saying is they're going through a pre-censorship review, like this is what our movie's about, this is what our script is about. Does any of this give you a problem or heartburn? They're trying to avoid producing something they later on have to edit so they can have it distribute in this market.
Correct. According to the report, there is a quote that Xi Jinping says often. He would like films to, quote, tell China's story well, end quote.
Professor Hung, do you believe Hong Kong should continue to enjoy its reputation as a center for international finance, given the power the Communist Party of China now exercises over foreign companies, the last year's detainment of and arrest of business executives? Should they continue to be considered the sort of international hub that's safe to do business in?
Thank you, Senator Rubio. Then I think, as I outlined in my testimony, there's a lot of troubling sign that the nature of the Hong Kong Financial Center on the institution that protect its integrity and fairness has been deteriorating. There's some remaining institutions and practices that separate Hong Kong financial market from, for example, Shanghai or Shenzhen financial market, but the direction of the development is really troubling. And I think what we and U.S. can do is to indicate the kind of measures that U.S. can do. For example, as I recommended, that it can be put on the table that at some point that U.S. can ban the investing in the Chinese government bonds, and just like what we have done with regard to the Russian sovereign debt, and also totally decertify that Hong Kong and stop recognizing Hong Kong as a kind of a financial market separate from the mainland China, and with regard to the access to U.S. dollar and many other measures. So this kind of option need to be put on the table and to let them know that if they go further, then that this will be enacted. Thank you.
My time has expired, but I thank you all for being here. I apologize I didn't get to you, Mr. Cooper, but I thank you all for being a part of this.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman Steele, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all the witnesses coming out, and I'm just so grateful because we really have to make China transparent and stop the human rights abuses. So the Chinese Communist Party has a long history of using threatening and violent tactics to silence those who want to speak out against the government. As mentioned, the disappearance of Feng Shui once again highlights the serious issue. Olympic is coming up in February next year. This week, I had to send a letter calling on the corporate businesses who are sponsoring the Beijing Games to follow the lead of the Tennis Association and use their platforms to call out China's human rights abuses. So I have a first question is, Ms. Wang, do you feel other global companies have an obligation to speak out like we saw with the Women's Tennis Association? Why are these companies feeling the pressure from the CCP?
Thank you for this question. Yes, I do believe that corporate sponsors and businesses do have an obligation to speak up and to follow the WTA's lead. I would like to point our attention to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And this document provides guidelines for both states and companies on how they can best address and prevent human rights abuses. And furthermore, what I think is most crucial and important about these guiding principles is that it states that when there are conflicting requirements, so for example, in US and China, companies must honor internationally recognized standards of human rights. So for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Thank you very much for your answer. And China has routinely violated international standards related to intellectual property rights. We really have a problem with that, not just US, but other countries too. And then subsidization and overcapacity, and they do not abide by the international norms and rules that have brought it to its current economic position. So I want to ask Dr. Cooper or Bonnie Glaser, Ms. Glaser, how can other global leaders hold China transparent and accountable in an international system that is free, open, and fair? And is that really possible?
Thank you, Congresswoman. This is such an important question. I think there are at least 3 steps that we have to take. First, the United States has to realize that it needs to work with allies and partners to address this issue. Addressing it unilaterally has not been effective. So we need to work with our key allies, especially the G7 countries and perhaps an expanded group of countries, to address Chinese unfair economic practices, especially intellectual property theft. That means, in my view, that we have to be looking at trade agreements that would hold China and others to high standards. So I know this is a difficult issue up on Capitol Hill, but that means thinking about what is the Trans-Pacific Partnership or its follow-on agreement going to be, and how can the U.S. take a leadership role there, not just in bilateral discussions with China. And then finally, I think we have to make this a key issue in the relationship. So China always talks about its core issues. Well, there's something like $300 billion of U.S. intellectual property being stolen each year by China. That has to be a core issue from an American perspective on the relationship, and China has to understand that if it doesn't adapt its behavior, that's going to have some very severe negative effects over the long term on the U.S.-China bilateral relationship.
Okay. Thank you very much. Professor Hong, the Chinese government has worked hard to manipulate public opinion and censor pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong. What does it look like for American business that want to do business inside of Hong Kong? What kind of censorship, intimidation are we seeing in Hong Kong today by the CCP?
Thank you very much for the question, Congresswoman. Then the American business and foreign business have been complaining about unfair treatment and unlevel playing field and biased regulatory enforcement in mainland China for a long time. And for a long time, Hong Kong has been upholding its separation from mainland China in this regard and maintain a kind of a relatively fair and open, transparent corporate environment. But unfortunately, in the recent years, it has been deteriorating in Hong Kong, and many American business and foreign business in Hong Kong are starting to face some of the same challenge that they have been facing in mainland China. And particularly after the implementation of the national security law, it's not only the national security law that create additional political economic risk to American corporation, but the political environment has changed, and the government's mentality and assumption has changed. For example, in the recent months, there's a draconian quarantine and I would say unscientific closure of the borders of Hong Kong. And then the American business and Chamber of Commerce have been lobbying the Hong Kong government to relax this rule because it is very bad for global firms in Hong Kong. They cannot see their families and they cannot travel. But they didn't listen, and then they didn't listen. So the government definitely now take a kind of a priority on the political consideration over economic consideration, and the situation in Hong Kong is deteriorating for the American and global business there.
Thank you, Professor Hong. Yeah, so, you know what, it seems like it's getting worse and worse every day. How are you going to fix it? And how Hong Kong government can really participate and work and try to make sure that these American businesses, that, you know, they can just do free business here, like, you know, just most of countries that they go in and they can do as long as they follow the rules. But these rules are getting tougher and tougher because Chinese government is imposing. How are we going to fix this, and how are we going to go, and what is Hong Kong's future?
For one thing, that some American business and other foreign business in Hong Kong have been diversifying their operations to other financial centers farther away from China, and for example in Singapore, and then they can continue to do business with their Chinese clients, but no longer in Hong Kong, but in Singapore. In fact, some private equity funds run by some well-connected mainland Chinese businessmen has already reportedly diversified their operation to Singapore. And it is going to be a trend, and definitely that the CCP and the Hong Kong government want to maintain Hong Kong as a financial center, but with the deteriorating regulatory environment and the other situation, that it can turn Hong Kong into another kind of financial center. It is what I worry about. That is a kind of financial center which is more like Caribbean tax haven and money laundering center. It is also a financial center with a lot of money coming in and going out, but it will be very different from the financial center of Hong Kong right now, that based on fair and transparent corporate governance and open of information and so on and so forth. So it can become like that, and if it is the case, then it will be very unfortunate.
So this is
Thank you very much. We now turn to Senator Langford.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thanks to all the witnesses for bringing the facts and information to our conversation today. Professor Hong, I want to continue on with our dialogue on this, on the Belt and Road Initiative and what China's doing in countries around Africa, around multiple regions of Asia, around the Western Hemisphere, Central and South America, to be able to influence markets, but also to be able to control minerals, to control ports, control airports, and to be able to take on some of the sovereign debt. You have written about some of these issues, specifically about them taking on debt around the world and how sustainable that is, but also the effect for those individual countries as well. Can you elaborate more on that?
Thank you very much for the very important question. And actually, that is the design and the intention of the Chinese government to use Hong Kong as a kind of an offshore financial center, as to channel money and to finance a lot of this kind of Chinese companies going to Belt and Road. And in this regard, and China definitely is extending a lot of loans and debt to the Belt and Road country. But at the same time, that U.S. still have a leverage to shape how this development can unfold, because many of the Belt and Roads loans that or out of Belt and Road and bilateral loans or multilateral loans for the AIIB are actually denominated in US dollar. The reality is that the world economy is still very much reliant on the US dollar as the reserve currency and a kind of a transaction currency. And so a lot of these developing countries and in Asian countries, when they borrow money from China, they refuse to take a renminbi loan. And actually it's very typical development is that in the beginning, Chinese will try to lend in renminbi, but actually the debtor is not interested. So in the end, that China is lending in US dollar. And so far as China is relying on US dollar, then the many Chinese entities and Chinese corporations are relying on Hong Kong financial market to raise debt and bonds in US dollar, and through the Hong Kong financial market, raise capital in Hong Kong dollar, which is actually packed with the US dollar and fully convertible. So in this regard, in the international transaction clearance and through the SWIFT systems, and also the Hong Kong access to US dollar, US still has a lot of leverage in influencing the China behavior in Belt and Road and the developing world.
Dr. Cooper, earlier, Ms. Wong was asked about Australia, and I want to be able to drill down this a little bit more on supply chain issues and what example we can take from what China has done using economic leverage on Australia to our own supply chain issues that we're facing now and the potential for that in the future. So Ms. Wong had the opportunity to be able to answer that. Dr. Cooper, I wanted you to be able to also talk about this as well. What should we see from the issue of Australia? What should we learn from that? And what awareness should we have on our own supply chain issues?
Well, thank you, Senator Langford. I think Australia is a really important case for several reasons. The first is that actually China has struggled to get its political objectives obtained in Australia, and I think it's done remarkable damage to Beijing's cause. Now, I will admit that I think a lot of friends in China don't acknowledge how much damage China has done. But if you look at the objectives that China appeared to have, and here China was quite clear. In fact, the Chinese embassy in Canberra gave a list of 14 demands that they were seeking from the Australian government. And I think they've obtained precisely 0 of those demands through this economic coercion campaign. And in fact, if you look at the Australian economy, there are roughly 11 different products that were directly affected. Only 1 or 2 of those were not relatively quickly shifted to other global markets. So the damage done to the Australian economy has been much less significant than I think many in China and even many in Australia would have imagined. So I think it's a good reminder that, in fact, the world still has substantial leverage to push back against China, and even countries that are targeted can withstand that pressure, as Australia has. Now, it comes at a cost, but we're seeing increasingly that countries are willing to bear those costs, and I think the Lithuania case right now is another important example. So I think what we should take away from the Australian case is, first, you probably can't escape this kind of pressure unless you're going to fully agree with China on every issue, which very few countries and companies are willing to do. And second, that when the pressure comes, that countries can stand firm against it, especially if they have allies and partners that are willing to stand with them.
Dr. Cooper, thank you. Ms. Wong, you've talked extensively and written extensively on the issue of Taiwan. It's very different than Australia, or very different than the United States in the threats that they face in Taiwan in particular. They're exceptionally isolated. Could you get a chance to talk about some of the economic pressures that are facing right there and in Taiwan, and what the United States in particular can do to be able to lessen some of the economic pressures, and what other countries, as China tries to cut off diplomatic relationships with any country that has diplomatic relationships with Taiwan, what other countries can do to actually support the people of Taiwan rather than isolate them?
Thank you. The topic of Taiwan is quite sensitive to the Chinese government, as we all know. Taiwan is one of the sensitive 3 Ts, along with Tibet and Tiananmen. Taiwan is increasingly under pressure from the Chinese authoritarian government. They're diplomatically isolating them, and they're bullying them on a geopolitical level. I think what we can do to support Taiwan is to continue these delegations to visit the island and to meet legislators there as well. I would also be happy to look into this in more detail and respond in writing for the record. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate that very much. I really see what China did with Hong Kong as the model of what they're going to try to do with Taiwan as well, to be able to buy off political figures, to be able to use social media, and to be able to control the conversation in Hong Kong, to then be able to move in, get the laws changed, and to be able to take over quietly as the model that they'll try to do in Taiwan as well. There's a real risk to that in the days ahead, and ways that we can continue to be able to stand with the people of Taiwan, to be able to get actually facts and information to them about the brutality of the communist government, what they've done in human rights violations, and to be able to continue to protect their free and fair elections in the days ahead will be a tremendous asset to them in the world, and then also to increase diplomatic conversations with others. So I appreciate very much the engagement, all the witnesses that are here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Could I possibly offer just maybe 15 seconds in answer
Please,
to
go
that
ahead.
question? I think the most important thing that the United States needs and other countries need to do with Taiwan is to be signing economic agreements with them. This has been, I think, an unfortunate gap in our relationship with Taiwan. Even as we strengthen diplomatic and security ties with Taiwan, we are not negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement, a bilateral investment agreement. Since we are not in the CPTPP, there's very little we can do to help Taiwan get into that. The Europeans' Parliament has endorsed signing a bilateral investment treaty with Taiwan. But so far, of course, the EU has not opened those negotiations. So Taiwan is increasingly isolated economically. They have they've signed free trade agreements when Ma Ying-jeou was president with New Zealand and with Singapore, and then China has boxed them out of being able to sign other agreements. And I think it's really important for countries around the world to stand up to China, and we can do so and strengthen Taiwan's security and the economic prosperity of the island by negotiating such agreements. Thank you.
Ms. Glazer, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Langford. And we'll turn back to the House to Congresswoman Wexton, who represents Northern Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses for coming and appearing before us today and talking about this really important topic. You know, one of the things that has become clear to me the more that I learn about China is that they play the long game. You know, they think in terms of century or even millennia, and here in the US and in the West generally, we have a much shorter term time horizon. So we think about, you know, the fiscal year, or we think about our congressional term, or we think about, you know, when the next shareholder dividend is supposed to be paid. And China takes advantage of that, and they have methodically inserted themselves deeply into the economies, not just here in the West and in the US, but in just about every country in the world. And they have been able to do that by manipulating, you know, our systems and what we value here in the US. And here it's really kind of been twofold. It's been the cheap goods that they're able to that US companies are able to sell all around the world. And then it's also been access to the Chinese market, which is huge and extremely lucrative for US companies. So, Ms. Wang, I'm very glad that you mentioned the Women's Tennis Association. I want to get to that in a moment. But Ms. Glazer, I want to talk with you a little bit about your comments on the China pressuring US companies to do kind of their dirty work for them, right? And to lobby us here in Congress for what they want to see happen legislatively. And I know that most of us on this panel have been on the receiving end of this same kind of pressure about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And I'm glad to see that will hopefully be moving through the House shortly. But I know that I've been on the receiving end of that for my Uyghur Forced Labor Disclosure Act. And so, Ms. Glazer, if you could talk a little bit about the pressures that come from US corporations in order to do China's work for them here in Congress.
Well, thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think it's obvious, and many of us have talked about today, how companies are essentially lobbying members of Congress as well as in the U.S. government for the United States to lift tariffs on China, to take a series of actions that will certainly benefit those companies' bottom line, but will not necessarily, I think, be in the broader interests of the United States. I was at the U.S.-China Business Council annual gala this past week, where our Undersecretary of State, Jose Fernandez, really gave a terrific speech laying out some of the problems that that China presents, the challenges in stealing intellectual property and forced technology transfer, its subsidies to companies. And I have to say that many members of the U.S. Business Council, the companies, were almost embarrassed by the fact that a Biden administration official was giving this message, because ultimately what they want to do is just do more trade and more business with China. So I think that this is a problem, and I think that we should be trying to bring companies together to understand the consequences for our shared interests, and particularly when it comes to forced labor in Xinjiang. This is something that we should be naming and shaming companies that are sourcing some of their products in Xinjiang.
Thank you so much, Ms. Glazer. And it's really not just the forced labor, it's also the genocide that's going on, which brings me to the upcoming Olympics in Beijing for the Winter 2022 Olympics. You know, that's just weeks away. And Ms. Wong, I'm very glad that you mentioned the Women's Tennis Association and its CEO, Stephen Simon, because he truly deserves to be held up as an example of you know, how to handle the Chinese government's intimidations. And I want to add my voice to the chorus of those calling out the IOC for their role as a propagandist in chief for the CCP on this issue. You know, they don't have the best history, but they've really hit a new low with this. And so I'm very concerned with the upcoming Olympics that we're not going to be able to ensure the safety of the U.S. athletes and the world's athletes there. But you know, I'm just encouraged that the U.S. has instituted this diplomatic boycott. I do hope that other nations will join us. I do want to commend Lithuania for really punching above their weight in this area when it comes to pushing back against China's abuses. Now, the WTA is tiny compared to so many of the multinational corporations who are sponsors of the Olympics and who are very, very entangled in their markets over there. You know, and it's fair to say that they will be hurt more by their pulling out of China than the PRC will. But what if, let's say, what would happen, Ms. Wong, say if Nike or Coca-Cola or Apple were to make their stance, you know, on this known and start pulling their supply chains and their products out of China?
Thank you. So I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question? You want to know what would happen
What would happen if some of these U.S. corporations like Nike or Apple were to start pulling their supply chains out of the Chinese market?
Thank you. I think that would be wonderful news. It'd be great if we saw Apple, if we saw Coca-Cola, and all pull out of China because they're following WTA's lead and standing firmly with human rights and avoiding complicity. According to international law, corporations should not be aiding and abetting human rights abuses. So I would greatly applaud Apple and Coca-Cola if they do not abide to the Chinese government. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Glazer, do you have any ways that the U.S. Congress and the administration could support those businesses who do wish to support the WTA and take action against China?
So I thank you, Congresswoman. I will think about that and get back to you. But I do think we should come up with incentives so that we can give companies a reason to not stand by China. Perhaps, you know, reputational advantage isn't enough. In the case of the WTA, of course, the opposite outcome. If they had not taken the act that they did, I think we would all be condemning them. So the risk of that reputational cost, I think, is important. But I think we should think about more incentives, and I will think about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
I see
much,
my time has
Congresswoman.
expired. I'll yield back.
Thank you. We are now going to turn to Senator Ossoff of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question I'd like to pose to the panel as a whole, beginning with you, please, Ms. Glazer, is when, in your view, have the various policies that we're grouping under the rubric of Chinese economic coercion, when have they been effective from the standpoint of the CCP and achieved the aims of the CCP, and when have they failed?
Well, that's a terrific question. I do talk about that a bit in my testimony. The the first case in 2010 against Norway, I think, was very effective. And not because of the economic consequences, because they were actually short-lived, and Norwegian salmon producers were able to circumvent restrictions and get their salmon through third markets to China. But the political consequences for Norway were deemed unacceptable. They were frozen out for many years, and finally in 2017 signed a joint statement with China, which if you read it, you can tell it was written in Beijing, that condemned any action that would violate the One China principle, and basically Norway pledged that they would never damage Chinese interests in any way, shape, or form again. In the case of Mongolia, the Mongolian government said that it would not invite the Dalai Lama to visit Mongolia again. So that was another successful case. Even the case of the 2010 Japanese case, where Japan agreed to release the captain of the fishing boat that had collided with the Japanese Coast Guard ship. It was successful in the short run. China did get the captain to be released. But of course, over the longer term, it was just the beginning of the really significant turn in Japanese sentiment against China. So I would say they ended up paying a price for it because the effort to curtail rare earth exports to Japan, which at that time Japan was about 90% dependent on China for its rare earth exports. With imports, within a decade, Japan brought that down to 58%. And that is an example for so many other countries, again, about the need to diversify, find other sources for goods and not be overly trade dependent on China. There are other cases, but I will leave you more time to ask questions to other witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, same question to you, please.
Well, thank you. It's a wonderful question, and I'll agree with everything that Ms. Glazer said, and just add on that I think what we've seen is that the smallest players are the most vulnerable, especially when you're a small player and you're highly dependent on China for certain parts of your market. So if you look at the Philippines with tropical fruits and bananas in particular, huge vulnerability there. If you look at other countries like Vietnam with tourism, at times, that's been highly effective. I think the countries that actually have stood more strongly against this kind of economic coercion and been less vulnerable to it are not surprisingly the bigger countries. So China has often avoided targeting the United States with these kinds of economic measures. At least maybe it's gone after individual companies or individuals, but it hasn't gone after the United States as a whole for the most part. It hasn't gone after the European Union as a whole. Look who it's going after now, one of the smallest member states in the EU, right, and Lithuania. I think there's a reason for that. What I think we need to do to demonstrate solidarity with those smaller countries is stand behind them and show that through either an anti-coercion mechanism or some other collective action that actually China can't isolate these smaller countries and that big countries are going to stand beside them. That, I think, has to be the key message, because otherwise Beijing will be able to continue picking off smaller countries and companies and individuals one at a time.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Ms. Wong, the same question to you, please.
Thank you. I will be speaking from a human rights dimension. I believe, of course, China's intimidation and censorship has long been around for decades. So, for example, one of the earliest examples that we can refer to is Disney. Back in 1996, there was a Disney film called Kundan featuring a story about Tibet and the Dalai Lama, and that resulted to a Disney ban in 1999. And that ban was only lifted because they had conversations with the Chinese government to open a Shanghai Disney World and also the cartoon Mulan. And this intimidation has been around specifically more about the three T's, Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen. But I believe we saw an uptick in 2019 surrounding the anti-extradition protests in Hong Kong. And I believe there is this uptick then because the protests really captured the global spotlight. And that's when the Chinese government realized that they have these tools at their disposal. They have these tools that they honed in for decades to silence criticism and dissent. So from this perspective, I think China's coercion in intimidating and censoring companies and businesses really increased in 2019 and up until now, and it will only increase as we approach the Beijing Olympics.
Thank you, Ms. Wong. And Mr. Hung, my time has expired, but I'll send that question to you for the record. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again to our panel.
Thank you very much, Senator. And now we'll turn to the House side. Congressman Mast from Florida's 18th Congressional District.
No, I thank everybody for their testimony. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the analysis. There was probably one of my favorite speaking spoke about a number of things in this speech, but he gave a poignant phrase at one point, which has been used different times throughout history, and it said, "Those who had the most to lose have done the least." Can somebody in this panel prove me wrong, prove that sentiment wrong in this case, as it relates to this chameleon, crooked communism China that we're dealing with, and the 3 T's that were just brought up, and COVID-19, and the list could go on and on, all of the economic coercion that we see across the globe, whether from to large economies or strong economies, to smaller economies and weaker economies. Could somebody prove me wrong, or rather prove that sentiment wrong, not me wrong, but prove that sentiment wrong, that those that have the most to lose have done the least as it relates to this situation?
I'd be happy to jump in, Congressman, maybe to try to give you an example. I think actually Taiwan has an enormous amount to lose, but it certainly has not done the least. Taiwan has been sending about, if you include Hong Kong and Macau in their exports in 2020, I think the export level rose to over 40%. I think it hit almost 44% of their exports that year. And it is coming down now, and I think has dropped now to under 40%. But we have seen Taiwan, I think, in really significant ways, stand up to China. And they are doing so not just economically and trying to encourage their businesses to come back and reinvest, reshore in Taiwan, and have seen a great deal of success, in part because of the economic circumstances, of course, in China, as well as the tariffs. But they're also standing up to China politically, but I would say in ways that are consistent and prudent and not provocative, doing so in ways that are very much in the interests of the United States, which is one of the reasons that the United States has seen ever stronger relations with Taiwan in the last few years. Thank you.
No, I thank you for the thoughtful response. And I think it leads well into a follow-on question. What, number one, could we all learn from Taiwan's response, if you would call that the strongest response? And an additional follow-on to that would be this: why should the response not be provocative?
Well, I will address the second part of the question. Maybe give others an opportunity to talk about what we should learn from Taiwan. There are so many things. But if Taiwan were to take actions that were deemed by Beijing as being exceedingly provocative, we could end up in a situation where Xi Jinping decides to use force to, as they would say, reunify Taiwan with China. I think that would be catastrophic. And so therefore, I believe the best set of policies by Taiwan and by the United States is to help keep Taiwan strong and enable it to continue its practices of self-governance, being able to develop its own policies, to participate more in the international community, and as I mentioned earlier, sign free trade agreements and other trade agreements, which they are allowed to do under WTO. They are, after all, full members. So when I use the term provocative, what I mean is I worry about the potential for a Chinese attack on Taiwan. I want to see Taiwan continue to be safe and to be able to make their own decisions on behalf of their own citizens. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. And again, I appreciate the conversation on this. You know, your willingness to speak up on that front. I think for many of us, we could probably say, you know, there's a spoiler alert in this, in that it's not in my opinion, it wouldn't be whether Taiwan is provocative or not. And I'm not trying to dissect you in this way. I don't think you're trying to make all of these points, but it brings it up. I don't think it's that the fact that Taiwan is or is not provocative that keeps them from violent actions of China. It's only by China's decision that they've decided to not yet resort to a violent takeover of Taiwan, that has not yet occurred yet. I think probably many of us can sit here and believe that this is exactly what they're mulling over, chewing over, not as it relates to Taiwan's actions, but as it relates solely to China's desire. And in that, I would say that the greatest strength that we have is using any and all means to be provocative against China, letting them know that we will not tolerate these kind of actions on any front. Understanding that we're not waiting for an action to occur because they're reacting to somebody else. They're simply acting out of their own desire. And we have to be at that place of understanding of China in order to truly combat them.
May I add on? Thank you.
I would hope you would.
Thank you. I wanted to piggyback or answer your question about what can we learn from Taiwan. And I think we can all refer to Taiwan's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. They had their own #Taiwan model, all hands on deck approach. And I think what the US can learn is that, as Congressman Swozey mentioned in his opening remarks, we need a whole of government approach. How can we get everyone involved to stand with our values, to protect human rights, and to protect our democracy? Thank you.
I thank everybody for the time.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Senator Daines is en route to join us, but he's a couple minutes out. While we're waiting for him, I wanted to have you, Dr. Cooper, you note that China has this category, unreliable partner, and it's a list or a categorization that makes it hard for a foreign entity to participate in China's economy. Can you just explain how they're using that tool?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chairman. So the United States has a very formal, legalized approach to sanctions. And China has, for a very long time, had almost no formal legalized approach to sanctions. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is Beijing realizing that actually it would be helpful if Beijing had at least a quasi-legal approach. And so what it has done is create, in many ways, parallel processes to what we have in the United States. And in this case, it's called the Unreliable Entities List. And this, I think, is intended very specifically to be a response to the US Entities List, which is run by the Commerce Department. And so this Unreliable Entity List would, I think, very clearly target those companies that are engaged in behavior that Beijing thinks crosses some red line, and it's a little unclear exactly what those red lines would be, and it's unclear which companies would be targeted first. But I think what we do know is that China is looking to create what will at least appear to be legal mechanisms. The big difference here, of course, is that our mechanisms, our sanctions, are rooted in US law, and they tend to be for very specific actions, and they require legal justification. And the Treasury Department in particular spends a huge amount of time making sure that it can come to these conclusions. I think it's quite clear that Beijing will do nothing of the sort. a company will be on the list for highly political reasons, and it will be very difficult to tell what got a company on the list and how they might come off. And so that's the case not just with the unreliable entity list, but with some of the other sanctions that China is creating at the moment.
So they have they put a country or a company onto this list yet, or threatened to put a company or a country onto this list in order to obtain a change in behavior?
They have threatened to put several companies on this list. There were reports months ago about a handful of specific companies that might be listed, and my understanding is that they were not formally listed, but none of them have. Yeah, I think no one has at the moment, but other panelists may know more on that.
Thank you very much. Senator Daines of Montana.
Senator Merkley, thank you, and I want to thank you all for coming before this commission, providing perspective and expertise on this important topic. I spent nearly 6 years working on the ground in China as an American expat, launching brands once upon a time to compete against Chinese brands when I worked in the private sector. I've led congressional visits to China and neighboring countries several times. Just last month, I was in India, meeting with government officials and some tech leaders, talking about trade as well as the threats and the challenges that China poses to the United States, to India, other allies, and even its own people. It's clear that the U.S. needs to work closely with our allies to counter China's growing economic coercion, influence, and its efforts to export its surveillance state abroad. Dr. Cooper, it's clear that China is not satisfied with simply censoring its own population, but also seeks to influence speech and actions abroad, outside its borders, including the self-censorship of scholars, foreign publishers, businesses, even academic journals related to doing work in or about China. What do you believe are the long-term effects of such actions, and what could be done to help both governments and the private sector withstand such pressures?
Thank you, Senator. I think there are a number of long-term impacts. Many of them are quite detrimental to China directly. I think one of the clear impacts we've seen is that many Americans, including many experts on China, are unwilling to go to China today because they fear for their safety. And this is not a completely unfounded fear. On my last trip to China, one of the small number of people I was on a trip with ended up in jail later.
And what was the date of that?
I guess that was 3 years ago.
Okay.
Michael Kovrig, he's a Canadian citizen, now finally back in Canada after being detained in response to effectively an American court case against Huawei. So I think China has done tremendous damage to its own cause in many ways, and the difficulty with people, even experts on China, being able to go to China is going to be a real problem for understanding what's going on in Beijing, and for Beijing understanding what's going on outside its own borders. And I think that's another thing that we're seeing as a result of this censorship campaign, is actually many people in China don't understand how much damage China has done to its own cause abroad. They don't understand how bad the polling data is outside of China on views, not just of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, but on the country as a whole. So, we could get into the effects on individual companies and on down the line, but I think China's done tremendous damage to itself through many of these measures.
Yeah, just looking at the flow of capital, decisions being made just as we speak, or capital that may have been intended for foreign direct investment in China is now headed to other markets in the region and elsewhere. Australia, in particular, has been targeted aggressively by China. What can we learn from their experience? And what would you say is China's assessment of the reaction by the United States as well as other democracies?
I think we can learn a lot from Australia, particularly that if you're willing to stand firmly behind your beliefs, that you can make it through one of these pressure campaigns. And we're certainly not at the end of it yet. I don't know when Australia will get to the end of this campaign. But I do think the Chinese view tends to be that there's no reason to stop putting pressure on Australia, and perhaps eventually Australia will cave. I don't think that's going to happen, and I think it's in our interest to demonstrate that our alliance is very close and that we and our friends will stand with Australia. I think the AUKUS agreement was an effort to do so, but let me say that I think we need to do more for Australia economically. Australia is under economic pressure, and we've responded in part by tightening our alliance in the security area. But if you think about other countries that are going to come under pressure from China, they're not going to get their own AUKUS type deal. What they're going to want is US support, US economic support, and support from other like-minded countries. And so I think we have to do more to stand with Australia economically, to show other countries that actually, if they come under this kind of pressure, that their friends will stand with them as well.
Dr. Cooper, thank you. Ms. Wang, China is in the process of testing a digital yuan. While most countries that are looking at digital currencies are concerned about privacy implications, China's motivation stems in large part from a desire to gain insights into the financial lives of its citizens. How could a push by the Chinese government to spread the usage of the digital yuan outside of its own borders threaten human rights in neighboring countries and countries where China has made significant capital investments?
Thank you. I think pushing the digital yuan is a threat to human rights and democracy because essentially the Chinese government is exporting its authoritarianism and it is exporting its censorship by weaponizing their power. I think the export of surveillance we've seen play out in Tibet, we see it play out in the Uyghur region, and from there itself, we can see crimes against humanity, against millions of innocent people. So thank you for the question.
Dr. Cooper, with regards to Taiwan and China's ongoing and increasing pressure campaign on that democracy, what would be appropriate additional steps for the United States to take to support Taiwan and deter heightened Chinese aggression?
I think there are a number of military steps that we should take, and I think we should be focusing most on action and less on talk. But I think one thing that other panelists have already raised is the importance of economic ties with Taiwan. And one thing that we keep coming back to this morning is the importance of diversification. And we should be helping Taiwan diversify. That means giving it other economic options. And so whether it's the United States or Europe looking to make trade agreements with Taiwan, that's the kind of thing that gives countries leverage to push back against economic coercion. And I think that should be a top priority.
Senator Merkley, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. And I'm going to ask a few questions in closing here. First, I wanted to note, Ms. Glazer, that you and several panelists have suggested that we need to understand the landscape of economic coercion better by having companies systematically report both their potential exposure to the risk of Chinese economic coercion, but also incidences in which there are threats or actions taken in the form of coercion. Do you envision a particular congressional law that mandates companies to report in this fashion, and do we have model legislation for this?
That's an excellent question, Senator. I don't know whether we have any specific model that we can look to, but I do think that legislation is necessary in this regard because I think we can compel companies. This would have to be clearly defined. What is the information that we are asking them to convey or report? Is it going to be the percentage of their exports that go to China? How much perhaps they have invested in China? I mean, those are examples of exposure. Are we going to just narrow it down to areas where there are national security implications rather than trying to identify writ large what the exposure of a company is economically to China? So I think we'd have to think through exactly what the purpose of it is, but I think that that's an exercise that is very much worth considering, and I think that Congress should take up this issue.
Okay, well, I invite you and others to brainstorm what that might look like, and any information you have on conversations that have been held with our multinationals in regard to how they might support or have concerns that we could address in that regard. Another point raised for potential legislation was a compensation fund. And would anyone on the panel like to address how that might work? Yes.
So,
Dr. Cooper.
yeah, I think in the long term, we need some sort of compensation fund, not to fully compensate those that are targeted. That's probably impossible, but to demonstrate solidarity with those that are targeted. So if the political message coming out of a Chinese coercion campaign is that the rest of the world, or at least a big subset of states, are standing with the country that has been targeted, that's a very different message than, oh, they've just been left on their own. And that means both that we need to have a coercive response to China, right, a strong deterrent, but also that we have to provide at least some support. Right now, for example, one of the messages you hear often in Australia is that the United States has actually benefited from China's sanctions on Australia because, for example, American producers of various goods are now replacing Australian producers in China. That's the wrong message. We need the message to be that like-minded governments are standing with one another. So I don't think we're talking about a huge amount of money. The question in my mind is, how do you do this in a way that doesn't clearly violate the World Trade Organization? So there's been talk, for example, of could you have a countervailing action that would go against certain Chinese companies that would gather some funds and that could be redirected towards the companies that have been harmed by Chinese action. I think that's probably WTO violating, but I think those are the kinds of discussions that I would expect to be hearing the next few years as people think through ways to do this.
Thank you, because I think it's important to put forward models of what that might look like and test them. What happens when the World Tennis Association says we're foregoing games in China, or the NBA says we are going to withdraw our extensive strategy for basketball league in China. It might be a little simpler when a single company, a single product is affected, but what that looks like, and whether this is an international effort or just nation by nation. And then I want to turn to the blocking laws, and Dr. Cooper and Dr. Hung, you both mentioned in your testimony the anti-foreign sanctions law. This was back in June of 2021. It built on previous laws China had adopted in expanding the private right of action and creating a counter control list that could affect visas and freezing assets of foreign entities. And this is part of the new phase of Chinese strategy and economic coercion. It places companies in a tight spot between following their home country laws and then being subject to sanctions by China. Would either of you, Dr. Hung and Dr. Cooper, like to expand on the challenge this presents and whether China has used this strategy yet, and if so, what it looks like?
Thank you, Senator. That I would like to respond by saying that right now that the sanction regime that China trying to develop is much less effective and sophisticated than the U.S. one. That's Dr. Cooper already pointed out that the U.S. is very much legal based, and another reason is that the U.S. sanction regime is very much based on the international economic dependence on the U.S. dollar as a kind of reserve currency and as a kind of transaction currency. So a lot of U.S. sanctions against entities and against countries and financial institutions that doing business with them will be in trouble because the transaction need to go through the U.S. dollar system. And it is exactly why that China tried to extend the anti-foreign sanction laws to Hong Kong, but they backpedal, and then there's some estimation about they will delay it or they will actually cancel it, because actually the Chinese company depends on Hong Kong and depend on the Hong Kong financial market for access to U.S. dollar in raising capital and borrowing in U.S. dollar. So they're trying to turn the table by internationalizing the use of RMB, and then some of the question mentioned the attempt to popularize the use of digital yuan, and then creating a whole Chinese alternative clearance system and currency system. This is the thing that China actually is trying to do, but it's still a long way from achieving that. But in that regard, that it will be very important for the U.S. to vigilant about this China plan to develop an alternative clearance and currency system, and then uphold the international use of the U.S. dollar, which is the huge leverage that U.S. have regarding these sanctions issues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hung. And I have to note that I may be approaching the last person to vote, and so my team is telling me I need to conclude the hearing. But I think this new phase that China is involved in of creating a legal regime to try to reinforce its strategy of economic coercion is one that merits a lot of attention. Thank you all very much for your expertise and testimony today. To summarize, China is engaged in a massive acceleration of its strategy of economic coercion. Its goal is to silence criticisms around the world, to be able to conduct egregious actions, whether it's stripping Hong Kong of political rights or engaging in genocide, and have the world not respond. But here in the free world, it's essential we stand up for our values, our human rights values. It's essential we respond. A huge thank you to the Biden administration for announcing yesterday a diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games, and we must challenge every other nation in the free world to join us. A huge thank you to the Women's Tennis Association for being very powerful in its response to Ms. Peng's treatment, the tennis star's treatment by the Chinese government. They're really setting a great example. We need to carry forward and work on the suggestions that you all, as a panel of experts, have put forward today, including exploring having companies report on their exposure to economic coercion, proceeding to have companies report on any attempted coercion, and then we need to work in partnership with the rest of the world, because the United States by itself cannot be effective in responding. So thank you for standing up for the human spirit. China has said that it's criticizing the United States for its diplomatic boycott, saying it's not in keeping with the Olympic spirit. I'll tell you what's not in keeping with the Olympic spirit of uplifting humanity, and that's crushing humanity by stripping people of their political rights and engaging in genocide. Thank you all very much. And the official closing here is that the record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, December 10th, for any items members would like to submit for the record or any additional questions for our witnesses. This hearing is adjourned.